Now, the greatest radio shows of all time.
Suspense.
The Shadow Node.
Washington calling David Harding, counter-spy.
Classic radio theater.
The Great Gildersleeve.
Fibber McGee and Molly.
Dragnet. Gunsmoke.
The Lone Ranger.
Now, step back into our time machine with your host, Wyatt Cox.
Good evening, friends of the Inner Sanctum.
Well, I had a little more energy this weekend and decided to spend some time talking about the news this time around. And radio news coverage back in the 30s and 40s, which is much different than we have today. And I am not going to say that it is more or less biased, because through much of that time, apart from spot news coverage, which really didn't take hold until the 40s, and even in the 40s, most people got their news from news commentators, not necessarily news reporters. So many cases, they were giving their opinions as to what was going on. We're going to start off, though, with a kind of a rarity, and the folks over at Rand's Esoteric, a blog which is disappearing, posted a rarity here, an episode of a syndicated program, the 20th Century International Radio Newsreel, and an episode from February 24th, 1939, where reporter Michael Blair interviewed arriving passengers and celebrities from the Panama-Pacific Lines SS Washington at San Pedro Harbor. Only one episode of this series is known to exist. And let's listen to what radio newsreels were like in 1939.
This is the 20th Century International Radio Newsreel in cooperation with the Special Events Department of radio station KNTR. This is your radio reporter, Michael Blair, speaking. And ladies and gentlemen, we have our microphone today down at the Panama-Pacific Lines, where that beautiful, gigantic liner, the SS Washington, has just come into port. Now, the passengers are coming out. There were approximately 750 passengers in all, and among them the Baron and the Baroness Henry de Bobigny and their two children, Helene and Louis, who arrived from Paris on the Washington last Thursday and have sailed all the way out here to California. And in addition to that, we have a great many celebrities down here at the docks today. We have Mr. McAuliffe, president of one of the large companies, and we have Captain Giles C. Stedman, commander of the Washington, and we hope to have the captain on a little later. As the prominent passengers come out, I'm going to interview them, and I'm going to ask you in the meantime to stand by. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now brought our microphone down to the foot of the main gangplank on the liner, the USS Washington. And at present, we have the ship's charming hostess who just woke up. May I ask your name?
Mrs. Cornell.
Mrs. Cornell. Well, Mrs. Cornell, how do you think the passengers liked the trip?
Oh, very, very much like it.
They liked it very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as the passengers come down, Miss Cornell is going to stand by, and we're going to get a few of them on the air. And by the way, Captain Harry Manning, the navigator, for the first projected round-the-world flight of Amelia Earhart. And the captain had rather a serious accident last year, but he's almost completely well. How did the captain take the voyage, Miss Cornell? Quite well. Well, we expect to have him down. Everybody is coming by here, and they're saying goodbye to Miss Cornell, and a lovely trip, and how are you? We're so glad we came along. You can probably pick them up. And crowd just walking down, very jovial, and so far we haven't seen a person that looks seasick as yet. That's such a tremendous boat that we can't imagine that it would roll very much. The liner is so gigantic that when you go on it, it's almost like standing on a solid floor in an apartment at home. Here come some of the passengers. I'm going to get one of them on the air. Pardon me, sir.
Mr. Harper from Pittsburgh.
Mr. Harper from Pittsburgh. Mr. Harper, will you tell the radio listeners, how did you like the trip on this new boat?
Oh, we had a swell time, and I'd like to have a trip all over.
Thank you, Mr. Harper. Now, let's see. Pardon me, sir. Will you tell our radio listeners how you like the trip on the boat?
Fine.
Fine, he says. Well, I'm going to try and get someone up here who'll spend a little bit more time and tell you something about it. And right now I see one of the executives.
Mrs. Whiting.
Mrs. Whiting, will you say a few words to the radio listeners? How did you like the trip?
I thought it was a wonderful trip, one of the best
Anything
trips I've
special
ever been
happened?
on. No, it was very, very interesting, and everybody was very nice. I enjoyed it tremendously.
Everybody was very nice. Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Whiting.
Mrs. Giles Whiting.
Ladies and gentlemen, now coming down the gangplank is Mr. Charles Hand. He's the assistant to the president of the United States line in conjunction with the Panama-Pacific. Mr. Hand, how about taking you over here and tell us something about this new liner? It's the largest out here, isn't it?
It's the largest, the fastest, and I think the most luxurious liner ever built. And the largest liner flying the American flag. The purpose of this visit largely is to familiarize the West Coast with the facilities of American ships, the United States lines. The Washington has come here to call at Los Angeles and also to take a very goodly sized passenger list to the fair at San Francisco.
About how many of your passengers would you say are going up to the fair?
About 650.
Some of them staying on and continuing right on?
Yes, that's true, but they're visiting, of course, for the day and tomorrow at Los Angeles.
Well, that's very interesting. Who do you see? Oh, the Baron de Bobigny and the Baroness. Baron, will you just tell the radio listeners, how did you like the trip?
I don't know what to talk.
The Baron says he doesn't know what to talk right now. He's got a very beautiful little boy. I'm going to try and get the Baroness on, as the Baroness... Baroness, will you tell... No? The Baron just came back and said, you ask Mr. Lee, whoever that might be, and he can tell you. Right now, they're giving Mr. Introductions, the Baron. He's leaving, thanking Miss Cornell for a lovely trip.
Here comes Mr. Lee from London.
Is this Mr. Lee?
No, way up the top.
Way up at the top. What does Mr. Lee do?
He's from London. He's quite a prominent real estate man in London, I think. I don't know.
Do you think he'll be able to give us some interesting information?
He will.
Swell.
L-E-I-T-H.
Waiting for him. Great big strapping fella coming down now. Here he is. We're just waiting for him to come up. How do you do, Mr. Lee? Would you say something to the radio listeners and tell us how did you like this trip on this new boat? I should say liner.
I'm Claude Lee of London, England. It has been a very great privilege to travel down from the East Coast to the West on this marvelous ship, Washington. I often come to America, and I can assure my listeners the next time I shall certainly want to travel on the United States line ship.
You really... are you going up to see the fair? Tell me that.
Oh, yes, one of the reasons I've come here is to see this marvelous fair.
Did you see the New York World's Fair?
Well, it hasn't opened yet.
Well, that just shows you. I've been back at the sticks for a long time. Miss Lee, would you say something?
I'm very thrilled to be over here. It's my first visit, and I hope to make many more. So far, it's begun perfectly.
Well, thank you. Here comes Mr. Magnus, and the name is very familiar.
Magnus.
Where from?
Magnus.
Mr. Magnus, will you tell our listeners how you like the trip, what you think of this new boat, liner? I'm calling it a boat, but it's one of the largest liners we've seen out here on the West Coast in many a year.
It's my second experience on the steamship Washington. I've traveled to a great extent on some of the foreign boats, but give me the American Merchant Marine any time. The cuisine, the service, everything that you would want is exceptionally fine. We've had a most enjoyable trip. I'm happy to come to California, my first trip. Look forward to seeing the various spots of interest.
Thank you very much, Mr. Magnus. And now Mr. Reddy's coming. Now, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Magnus is former president of the New York Board of Trade. And now here comes Mr. Reddy, the manager of the Waldorf Astoria, one of New York's most exclusive hotels. I'm going to get him over here, and perhaps he'll tell us something. How do you do, Mr. Reddy? Will you come in and tell the radio listeners how you like the trip and this great big line of the Washington?
Well, we had a wonderful trip. The first time that I've traveled on the United States lines, and I want to say that the boat is marvelous. Comfortable, the service is fine, and the food is wonderful. We had a great trip, and I hope to travel on the line many, many times.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Redding. You find this, in comparison with that grand hotel of yours back in New York?
Well,
up to the minute in every way?
Up the minute in every way. Both of them 100% American.
Thanks very much. Mr. Sherman Falls from Washington. Will you say something to the radio listener? Not a chance? Well, I've got a very charming young lady right now, and I believe I was introduced to you on shipboard. Phyllis Wheeler, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
And you know what the young lady up there told me? She told me you were the belle of the ball. Is that right? The belle of the ship.
Well, I don't know. I hope so.
This is a very beautiful girl. Tom Sawyer. What happened on the ship's ball? Give us the lowdown on that.
Well, everybody went in a costume, and I went as Tom Sawyer.
Mr. Hare, tell me something while the young lady's here. Mr. Hare is the president of the New York Rotary. Now, while Miss Wheeler is here, was she the belle of the ship?
Yes,
Give us the lowdown on it.
I was chief judge of that contest, and she certainly won the prize, hands down.
She really did.
Yeah.
All the young males trying to get an introduction, that sort of thing?
Well, she didn't seem to be bothered. They'd already gotten the introduction.
Can't we get a shipboard romance here? She's beautiful, isn't she?
I was sorry I didn't bring both sons along.
Well, I wish you had.
Well, Miss Wheeler, thanks very much, and loads of luck in California. Mr. Hill, how do you do, sir? Will you tell the audience how you like the trip?
Marvelous. In the company of Mr. Heller.
In the company of Mr. Who's Mr. Heller?
Right here, my friend.
Mr. Heller, how did you like the trip?
I thought it was marvelous.
What do you think of this new big liner on the Panama-Pacific Lines, the Washington?
As you say here in California, it was stupendous, gorgeous, and tremendous.
Well, thank you very much. And now Miss Cornell has been a grand help for me.
This is Betty Keck going to Honolulu from Pittsburgh. Come on here, Betty. Come here.
Miss Keck going to Honolulu from Pittsburgh. Well, I'll come over to you then. If Mohammed won't come to the mountain must come to Mohammed. So tell us what you thought of the trip.
I had a very lovely time.
What do you think of the new line of the Washington?
I'm very, very much pleased that I came on it.
It's very American, I understand. Is that true?
Yes, it is. This is grand.
Up to the minute in service and everything?
That's right, every way.
How are your fellow passengers?
Grand.
Thank you very much, Miss Keck. Well, now here's rather a jovial crowd.
Yes.
Mrs. Miller. Well, will you say something to our radio listeners? How did you like the trip?
I just loved it. This is my second trip on the Washington. I just adore it.
You liked it so much the first time that you've decided to take another one.
Another one, indeed I have.
How do you find the service and everything?
Splendid.
It's a fine boat, you feel.
It's a splendid boat, lovely people, and I just couldn't think of anything for improvement.
What did you wear to the ship masquerade? What sort of a costume?
I wore a dinner dress.
A dinner dress. You probably got the award in that case for the most unique costume.
Most unique costume. I wore a mask along with it, which helped.
Oh, I wouldn't say that now. Miss Miller is very sweet, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very, very much. And now who are we getting down here?
On our way to Honolulu.
How do you do, Miss Braver? How did you like the trip?
Well, I loved it. I had a perfectly wonderful time, enjoyed every minute of it.
What do you think of the line of the Washington?
I think it's perfectly splendid. We had wonderful service all through, and I had a glorious time.
Well,
everybody was very kind.
Well, I'm awfully glad you enjoyed it. And ladies and gentlemen, I believe Captain Manning is coming down now. Was that Captain Manning that just went by? Miss Cornell is going to find out for me. Well, that wasn't Manning. He should be down very, very short. Here's a jovial elderly gentleman. Oh, yes, ma'am. How did you like the trip?
Oh,
very beautiful
fine.
girl.
It was a beautiful trip. Wonderful trip.
Uh-huh. Do you like the line of the Washington? What do you find about this gigantic new liner?
It's a beautiful boat.
Beautiful boat. Well, tell me, any shipboard romance?
No.
Did you know Phyllis Wheeler?
Yeah, very well.
Did you chum around with her on board?
Uh-huh.
Well, I don't doubt for a minute, having looked at both young ladies, that there were two belles of the ball.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Major Camel, will you say a word to our radio listeners? How do you like the line of the Washington and the Panama-Pacific Line?
We like it very much indeed. We had good service and good weather and a very, very pleasant trip.
Major, anything unusual or outstanding happen on the trip?
Not a thing.
Not a thing, but it ran very smoothly?
Very, very indeed.
Thank you very much, Major. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to stand by for a moment.
And that's the end of the disc that we have. It apparently went on longer, but the other discs apparently have disappeared into the veils of time. But that originally broadcast February 24th, 1939, the 20th Century International Newsreel. A newsy edition of classic radio theater here on your favorite station. By the way, just to remind you, over at MyPillow.com right now, they do have a special, and that is on the original MyPillow, queen size, $19.95, and that is a significant savings. MyPillow.com, promo code Wyatt. That's MyPillow.com, promo code Wyatt. All right, let us move on now to more commentary as it was broadcast back in the early-ish days of radio. Here's a commentary from the Blue Network of the well-known raconteur, columnist, commentator, and not liked by a lot of people, Walter Winchell and his Jergens Journal. This episode, in the middle of World War II, and this is, like I said, there were newscasts going on at the time, but most people still got their information from commentators. This one from September 5th, 1943.
The Jergens Journal, featuring Walter Winchell, America's one-man newspaper. His famous column appears in the New York Daily Mirror and more than 820 other newspapers. Walter Winchell is brought to you by Jergens, the lotion for soft, smooth, romantic hands. Do you do this? Do you take care to keep your hands nice and smooth but forget about your elbows? Of course, you don't see your own elbows, but other people do. So every night, pour a little Jergens lotion in the cup of your hand and rub your elbows round and round in it. Scaly, rusty elbows soon look creamy, velvety, and young, the way your hands do when you care for them faithfully with Jergens lotion. It takes only a second or two. Jergens leaves no stickiness. So help keep your elbows good-looking, too, with Jergens lotion. And now to the editorial room of the Jergens Journal and Walter Winchell.
Good evening, Mr. and Mr. North and South America and all the ships at sea. Let's go to press. Flash. Bern, Switzerland. An unconfirmed report states that Italy is on the verge of civil war. The King and Marshal Badoglio are reported safe in southern Italy. London. The commander-in-chief of the Italian fleet was killed on Friday when the German bombers destroyed the dreadnought Roma. Washington, D.C. Military observers in the capital expressed the belief tonight that Mussolini's reported rescue by the Nazis is a fishing expedition on the part of the Germans to find out just where the Duce is. Marchfield, California. Richard C. DuPont of the DuPont family of Delaware was one of 4 glider pilots killed in a crash today. Chicago. Despite the fact that the Chicago Tribune ignored his visit, Vice President Wallace attracted the second largest crowd in the history of the Chicago Stadium. His next speech, late this month, will be at Cleveland, Ohio. Washington. The Post Office Department, which has done nothing to stop the indicted publications charged with subversive activities, will attempt to stop the mailing privileges of Esquire magazine, one of the most patriotic magazines of them all. Attention editors in New England. A well-known congressman is expected to be indicted by the Washington Federal Grand Jury any day. Alleged mail fraud. Detroit, Michigan. Additional arrests by the FBI in the big spy case will be announced by John Edgar Hoover perhaps next week. New York City. The 80th victim of the Congressional Limited wreck last week died today. His name is Irving Ginsburg, a 17-year-old American of New York City. Philadelphia. The big fire at the Broad Street station today was finally brought under control after a 4-hour struggle. It was the second disaster suffered by the Pennsylvania Railroad in the very same week. Over 100 persons were injured. Behind the international front, London. Hitler's reserves are committed to the last man, meaning that he will be completely unable to counterattack on the Russian front. Hitler's full strength must be used to establish a battle line in southern Europe. London experts believe that Hitler's task is an impossible one, and that spectacular events, including German collapse, are a distinct possibility in 1943. Washington, however, is less optimistic. The capital nevertheless thinks that 1944 will prove too much for the Nazis. Ankara. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria need assurances only of an invading Allied army to desert Adolf Hitler. Rio. The reports persist that Argentina is approaching a crisis, this time of Butte. Bern, Switzerland. There is considerable support here for the belief that General Eisenhower intends to recognize Marshal Badoglio and the King as military governors until the end of the Nazi regime in Germany. Alexandria. As Italy was lost by the Battle of Africa, Japan may have lost the war by the Battle of the Mediterranean. With the Italian fleet no longer a factor, the British Mediterranean fleet can now devote its attention to the Indian Ocean against a Japanese fleet which already refuses to accept battle with our Navy in the Pacific. Attention editors in Boston, Massachusetts. George Curtis Bruce, an American newspaperman who has been broadcasting in Japan, is dead. The report is not confirmed, of course. Mr. Bruce, who refused a chance to come home from Japan, was managing editor of the Shanghai Evening Star. Attention, Mr. and Mrs. United States. The big guns which opened the gates of Italy also opened an American military secret. For a long time, our leadership endured insult because of its strategy and abuse for its tactics. Our leadership, ladies and gentlemen, endured the insults because it had to. The only way it could keep faith with our armies in the field was to keep silence at home. During the time of the greatest abuse, 3,000 blacked-out ships with 750,000 Americans on board crept up on a continent. If our leaders at home had offered one word of defense of this strategy, they would have imperiled not only the Army and the Navy, but the success of the war. However, the hecklers and the critics over here have been answered, not by any defense against their charges, but by successful attack against the enemy. General Eisenhower has stated that valuable lessons were learned in Tunisia. It is time that valuable lessons were learned over here in America. Under our Constitution, every nightclub commando and every Pullman car diplomat is entitled to his own opinion, but he is not entitled to share any military secret without which his opinion is sheer nonsense. 4 major offensives are now in the same state of preparation that resulted in the African and Italian victories. And like the last campaign, there is less danger from the enemy over there than from the fools over here. New York. The book sections of the New York Times and Herald Tribune today, Sunday, confirm what this newsboy knew all along, that the #1 bestseller in nearly every leading city in the United States is undercover. Mr. Gannett is choking, I think. A reporter's report to the people, at least 30 million of them. New York City. 4 railroad wrecks in the very same week may be a coincidence. And the alert FBI has announced that it detects no sabotage. But I wonder, as you probably do. I say I wonder because I have come across a most enlightening passage in Alan Hines' exciting book about spies. The title of that book, ladies and gentlemen, Passport to Treason. On pages 26 and 27 of the exciting Passport to Treason, the author quotes a Dr. Gassner, described as a Gestapo agent. Mr. Hines states that William Siebold, a spy caught by the G-men, who turned counter-espionage agent, was told this by Gassner, the Gestapo agent, quotes, "When the time comes, orders will go out to more than 100,000 loyal Germans in the United States to perform specific duties. There will be many railroad accidents that nobody will be able to account for." End quotes. Washington. One of the favorite clay pigeons of the monkey wrench tribe is Lend-Lease. They scream shouts of anguish about the way Lend-Lease is depriving Americans of everything, although our nation still enjoys the highest standard of living in the whole world. Most of the obstructionists and the divisionists blame the meat shortage on Lend-Lease. But what are the facts? Ladies and gentlemen, the President's latest Lend-Lease report to Congress reveals that 1% of our beef supply went to the Allies, an amount equivalent to 2/10 of an ounce per week for each person in the United States. And here's the irony of it. We have a food shortage because more Americans than ever can now afford to eat. New York City. His Honor, the Mayor of New York, and others are concerned about the boys and girls who have been making soft money during their summer holiday from high school. It is feared that many of these teenage students will not return to school tomorrow and will keep working instead of learning how to count up to 10. The defense plants and the cafeterias do not want these boys and girls. Parents who encourage them to quit school to make an extra few dollars are guilty of raising imbeciles. When this war is over, there will be a great demand for skilled trades and for those with an educational background for office work. Please, please do not permit your children to neglect school for work. We have enough morons and illiterates as it is, with too many of them winding up in the audiences who listen to the bunk of Gerald L. KKK. Ladies and gentlemen, the usual Jergens commercial is omitted tonight so that I may get something off my chest. Something I've wanted to tell Americans since the Treasury Department first went around the towns and the country on its knees begging people to buy bonds to help save their own liberty and lives. I think it is ridiculous that this government, to which we all owe so much, actually is forced to offer us patriotism at a profit. It is true, I know, that our soldiers, sailors, and Marines could not fight without your dollars. But believe me, your darling little dollar would not be worth 1 penny without them. You will hear 1,000 good reasons why these war bonds should be bought, but there isn't even one faintly reasonable excuse why they shouldn't be. I do not see why our government ought to promise us a profit in protecting our freedom and our lives, but it does. $4 for 3, when any American ought to force our government to take what it needs to survive. If the enemy ever landed over here, he not only would take your money and your finery, but he very likely would hit you over the head with his rifle to remind you to pay him more respect, since he would have taken all your money. In this total war, there are many ways of being a patriot. Some Americans are sweating in the tropical swamps. Other Americans are chilled to the bone by the Arctic blasts. And many Americans are at peace, having paid with their lives in the clouds and on the sea. Tonight, ridiculous as it seems, I am requested by our government to tell you that you can be a patriot by merely drawing interest. Washington, D.C. The Treasury Department just telegraphed the following last-minute figures on the third war loan drive. In the first 3 days, the war bond sales total $1,802,000,000. This is enough money to run the war for about 6 days. The Swiss-Italian frontier. Reports from Italy reveal that when Italian soldiers heard of the armistice, many of them charged into Nazi troops with bayonets. Several Italian officers committed suicide rather than surrender to the Nazis. Moscow. Russian guerrillas striking behind the German lines near Bryansk today surprised a column of Germans and shot 600 of them to death in a small ravine. Washington. The G-men have started a nationwide hunt for another escaped German flyer. He fled from a Canadian internment camp on August the 8th and is still at large. His name is Eckert J. Brosig, B-R-O-S-I-G, 23, 5 feet 8, weight 147, speaks some English. And that, ladies and gentlemen, winds up another Jergens Journal until next Sunday night at the very same time. Until then, and with lotions of love, I remain your New York correspondent, Walter Winchell, who knows we could have captured Mussolini in Rome weeks ago. But we didn't want to risk bombing the churches. Today, Mussolini and Rome are in the hands of the Nazis, whose specialty is bombing hospitals. Good night.
Maybe you haven't much time these days, or money either, for beauty care, but even so, you can give your face practically a treatment every day right at home. One lovely new cream, Jergens Face Cream, does the whole job. You use Jergens Face Cream as though it were 4 creams. Use it not only for cleansing and softening your skin, but for a marvelous powder base, too, and as a night cream, where even drab, dry skin is reconditioned amazingly soon to kissable, satin-smooth look of youth. Think of Jergens Face Cream as your one-cream beauty treatment and use it every day, 10 cents to $1.25 a jar. Next week, another edition of the Jergens Journal with Walter Winchell. And be sure to stay tuned to this station for the Chamber Music Society of Lower Basin Street with Igor Gorin as guest star, which follows immediately. This is Ben Grauer speaking.
This is the Blue Network.
Winchell, much less a commentator as a gossip columnist. He was not a solid newsman. But Winchell did break stories, and he was a celebrity. And I have to tell you that Winchell got in a lot of fights, got in a bunch of fights, and probably best known today as the narrator of The Untouchables back in the late 1950s, early 60s. Winchell passed away at the age of 74, February 20th, 1972. Alrighty, you are listening to a newsy edition of Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox, and we'll continue following these messages. Now let's listen to another news analyst here on Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox. This is Alex Dreier, who did a morning show on NBC. This episode originally was broadcast on October 11th, 1946. Much more newsy than Winchell, but still opinion in the program.
From the NBC studios in Chicago, Skelly Oil Company presents Alex Dreier with the First Network News commentary of the day. Well, friends, what are you planning to do this weekend? If the weather's nice, you may decide to hop in the old bus and take a drive somewhere. And you know, for thousands and thousands of motorists, that's one of the high spots in the weekend. But say, wait a minute. Before you start out, make sure that you're going to enjoy that extra motoring to the fullest. And by that I mean make sure that your car is in a number 1 shape from headlights to taillights. How do you go about doing this? Why, see your nearby friendly Skelly man, of course. Take it from me, he'll see to it that your car is correctly lubricated right down to the last spring. He'll check your tires over completely and see that they're properly inflated. He'll make sure your battery is filled and in good shape for driving. He'll go over your accessories one by one and check them all for maximum service. And last of all, he'll fill your tank right up to the top with some of that power-packing, pleasure-making Skelly gasoline. Remember, friends, safe driving is pleasant driving. So visit your Skelly man today and make sure you have it. And a happy motoring weekend to you all. And now the news. Here is Alex Dreier.
Good morning, and first of all, my deep appreciation and thanks to the newsmen who substituted for me during my absence. Bud Jackson of KVO, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Jack Dunn, WDAY, Fargo, North Dakota. Mark Weaver, WKY, Oklahoma City. Bob Young of KOA, Denver. Del Franklin, KSTP, St. Paul, Minneapolis. M.L. Nelson, WHO, Des Moines. And Ray Clark of WOW, Omaha, Nebraska. All performed to the best of their abilities and turned in a task well done. And again, my thanks to all of them and the stations which permitted their temporary absence. We'll wind through the highlights of the news and then once again record a few impressions, humorous and otherwise, of the Ozarks, where we have just spent a few wonderful days. Out of Washington, President Truman will probably decide the administration's final meat policy in 2 or 3 days. That decision, thus far, as you all know, has been the maintenance of ceilings. And when the Washington Report adds that the president may tell the nation of his decision by radio, one draws the conclusion that an explanation would only be necessary if the objective were to continue the ceiling on meat. Now, all kinds of explanations have been offered for the meat shortage, but none so obviously politically flavored as that coming from Richard R. Nacy, Executive Vice Chairman of the Democratic National Committee. Says Mr. Nacy, Republicans in Congress so butchered the original extension bill that the president had no choice but to veto it. and when controls lapsed, there was first a meat feast and then the inevitable shortage. So here again, more of the political football with all of its one-sidedness. Incidentally, Lloyd Swift of the U.S. Forest Service's Wildlife Branch tells us that although there may be some relation between the meat shortage and hunting, it will not be too much of a factor. And then he adds this note: hunters are killing off ducks faster than they can reproduce. Dr. Wallace Smith of Springfield, Missouri, please note. OPA has removed price controls from pure silk underwear and all other apparel and accessories made wholly from pure silk or pure linen. Out of Pittsburgh, that power and hotel strike shows no sign of ending. Federal and state conciliators have been holding a series of meetings, but nothing concrete has as yet developed. And the surprise walkout by Eastern and Gulf ship operators has all but scuttled government efforts to settle the 600-ship National Maritime tie-up, which began October 1st. State the operators. The position of the unions makes the continuation of negotiations futile. The primary issue is whether the unions should have contract provisions for preferential hiring of their members and maintenance of union membership. President Truman, once again exploding the report that this country has sent atom bombs to Britain, has thus laid to rest, or at least it is hoped has laid to rest, suspicions abroad that Britain and the United States are playing partners in a long-range military alliance. All atom bombs still remain in this country. And on the international scene, Archbishop Stefanac of Yugoslavia, charged with Axis collaboration, has been convicted and sentenced to 16 years of imprisonment at forced labor. Stefanac, head of the Roman Catholic Church in Yugoslavia, has had all of his property confiscated and has been deprived of all legal rights for the next 5 years. Out of Portugal, calm is reported once again after a short-lived bloodless soldier revolt that led the Salazar government to alert troops and cut telephone communications out of Lisbon. Berlin police are now warning the public of the German capital that cotton, or rather the former German capital, that cotton being sold in northern Berlin's black market happens to be highly explosive gun cotton. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor have left Paris en route to London, England, and following their visit to the British capital, they may then visit this country. Former Secretary of State Cordell Hull appears to be out of immediate danger at Bethesda Naval Hospital, where he suffered a stroke 12 days ago. The Navy's latest bulletin says he continues to show considerable improvement. Out of Boston, the Boston Red Sox and St. Louis Cardinals will play their 5th World Series game today in sunny weather. Well, as many of you know, we have spent the past week revisiting that inkwell of black majesty, the Ozarks, that collection of enthralling beauty which shows itself not only in silvery ribbons of water, the breathtaking panorama of mountains and valleys, or a punctuating expanse of green, but rather chooses to display its full beauty in its people. People bounded together by ties which seem almost to parallel the definitive bonds of attachment, as expressed in nature's wonders bundling the Ozarks together. The low waters of the upper White River, down which we floated, constantly seemed to say, "Bolton man, you're so small, so lost in this church of trees." Now no man has ever entered that grove without feeling the urge to bare his head, for those trees form a lofty-roofed cathedral set aside for the adoration of God. Well, there were many of us, about 30 fishermen and guides, trying to annoy the fish who wouldn't be annoyed, and if some were annoyed, they merely taunted our lures, cast disdainful eyes upon those who dared to enter their waters. They laughed, and we caught little, very little. But nature meant it to be that way, didn't she? The river's level was abnormally low, and never before had there been such a large float on the White River. So nature took a hand, it seemed, and the fish were not to be caught, much less seen. Only the strays, those who wouldn't listen, saw something attractive in our artificial lures. 3 days and nights under a quilt of stars with a coating of cavernous blue, and under a sun which burned the warmth of the Ozarks into our bodies, we moved down the White, and tumbled out of bedrolls in the morning when the lights above were twinkling their last, and a foggy mist hung over the river. Good fellowship saw expression in boisterous song and hot liquids, which defied nature's attempt to keep us cold, and then we were ready for our quarry. But on those days of the float, the shimmering bass were for somebody else, not us. And through that fast-breaking dawn, which seemed to come up like thunder, the inimitable and always entertaining Ralph Foster of Springfield, Missouri, would cut through the thick air with this Tarzanian call. It skipped across the water, ricocheted off canyon walls, then lost itself on some gravel bed. And as Foster would so aptly put it, That's for somebody else, not me. And as our boats went down the river, some 10 of them, it looked like another Lewis and Clark expedition, a chorus of voices ringing out over the still waters would carry this refrain, and so listen to Lewis Rowan.
Pa didn't raise any corn last year. Pa didn't raise any taters. Pa didn't raise any beans last year, but gee whiz tomatoes. Well, tell me, Alex, as one fisherman to another.
Thank you, Louis.
Oh, you're welcome. As one fisherman to another, what kind of bait did you use?
Well, I'll tell you.
I know. You used that new and improved pumpkin seed, the Lou Kane special.
Yes, and primarily because the fabulous Lou Kane, one of the greatest fishermen of all time, is Heddon's master salesman. That boy could sell a suit to a cigar store Indian and make the Indian think that he drove a pretty good bargain. But seriously, Louis, that country of the Ozarks is really fabulous, and nothing makes it quite so fabulous as its people, the Art Herricks and the Art Johnsons, and a pleasant mustached little fellow who is the most perfect personification of relaxation that I have ever met. He answers, and only when he wants to the name of Howard Garrison. He calls home a spot some 15 miles east of Springfield at the foot of the imposing hills which fashion the name Ozarks. Garrison is an artist, both in the preparation of good food and in putting down on canvas what the eye would like to see before it at all times. At first glance, his riverside country home of food looks like a page torn out of some dusty book of early Italian or Spanish history. The low protecting walls, dressed in white, peppered with flowers of every color, and vines that crawl relentlessly through bags of foliage bring the pages to life. You pass through a door that allows the musty smell of antiques to tickle your nose, and then the eye sweeps from one wall to another, walls crowded with colors, tantalizing reds and blues, yellows and browns, blacks and pinks. Here's a lady of the early 19th century, and over here a knight of old, and here's a woman of modern beauty, and over here a castle drawn from the past and projected into the future by the exquisite touch of a most unusual artist. Along corridor and stairway walls, and the walls of his lounge and dining room, more color. Here the vines of the outside brought to life in vivid paint. And Garrison never took an art lesson in his life. Yet through the magic of his hands comes the beauty of the past and the present, an exposé of a man's soul at the foot of the Ozarks, a man as ruggedly individualistic as the Ozarks itself. Comments, toothpick twirling, Howard Garrison.
I do all my painting when I'm in the mood, and when I get the time. I love to paint. It takes me away from a very dizzy and maddened world.
Well, as we said some weeks ago, little people, big people, the great and the near great, no walk of life is without them. Garrison belongs among the great that not only appreciate beauty, but do something about it as well. And then, and not to be forgotten, there was ink-spottish Clarence Coleman, whose melodies of song were a treat and a relief. Now, once again to Norfolk Lake and comedy, the kind of humor which Ralph Foster puts to life in these words. There's a word called misery, and misery, it loves company. That's why it sort of follows me.
Constantly.
My landlord never troubled me before. Why, he always said my rent was show. But now that man knocks on my door.
Constantly.
To which we might add, we kept throwing that plug into the water constantly. And constantly the fish laughed as the waters closed over bursting bubbles, and the fish descended to the safety of the lake's bottom. Yes, 7 days and nights isolated from radio and press, lost among the rivers and valleys and spiraling trees. It gives one a different perspective, makes one feel and understand the real meaning of that superior force which reigns in the heavens, makes one wonder why men try to shorten their already too short lives by bomb and bullet, makes one pray that peace among nations can come and stay as it has in the divine majesty of America's Ozarks.
Alex Dreier will return with more news in just a moment. How good are you on your history, friends? I mean, for instance, how far back do you think people knew about the advantages of hot water? Well, they knew its advantages and relished its use as long ago as we have historical records. Roman and Egyptian women knew its benefits as a beauty aid. Both men and women knew its benefits as an all-round aid to cleanliness and health. You know, if you wrote down all the ways you use hot water during the year, I'll bet you'd be amazed at the length of that list. Today, with Skelgas automatic hot water service so economical and convenient, there's no reason why you shouldn't have abundant hot water. Remember, there's a Skell Gas automatic water heater in the right size for your home. And remember, too, you can have Skell Gas automatic hot water service wherever you live, town or country. Have a talk with your friendly Skell Gas dealer today or tomorrow, sure. He'll be more than glad to give you all the details on Skell Gas and Skell Gas automatic water heaters.
Out of Washington, the new 5-cent airmail stamp may join the list of scarce items. The Post Office Department tells us that nickel airmail has met with such spontaneous approval that post offices all over the country are hard-pressed to meet the demand. Working around the clock, the Bureau of Engraving is producing 15 million airmail stamps daily in an effort to keep post offices supplied. Also out of Washington, the nation's draft boards will have to find only 15,000 men for the Army in November. Voluntary enlistment of nearly 1 million in the last year permitted the cut from the October quota of 35,000. The November quota is the smallest since selective service went into business before Pearl Harbor. And incidentally, if you can't get your favorite brand of chewing gum, blame it on the sugar shortage. Until the sugar situation improves, the chewing gum industry faces continued restriction of output, this according to the Commerce Department. And that's the news for now, and this is Alex Dreier wishing you good morning, safe motoring, and a happy weekend for Skelly Oil Company.
Listen again tomorrow morning as Skelly Oil Company brings you the highlights of the day's news and Lloyd Burlingham with the story of this week's Skelly Agricultural Achievement Award. Louis Rowan speaking. This is NBC, the National Broadcasting Company.
Well, you had some news in there, and there was some news in there. The chat was mostly about Alex Dreier's just completed holiday away from the microphone. But there you go. An episode of Alex Dreier and the News from October 11th, 1946. We'll have one more little bit of news in here, and we'll see if we have more commentary than news in 1951. That'll be coming up next here when Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox continues in a moment. Okay, let's conclude this episode of Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox with one more news commentator, Upton Close, and the News. This was originally broadcast on April 1st, 1951.
Today from Washington, Broadcasts Incorporated presents Upton Close, reporter, author, commentator, and observer of world affairs. Reporting today from the nation's capital with a distinguished guest, Congressman Harold Veldey of Illinois, former FBI man, now a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee. Now, the statesman of the air, Upton Close.
Hello, Americans. Last week we had Easter. This week, April Fool's Day. It should be the other way around. Easter is for awakening. Let's not become fools again. We have had the testimony of Larry Parks before the House Un-American Activities Committee here that he was a fool to join the Communist Party. He thought that Stalin was a hero doing fine things for freedom and tolerance. He thought that Myron Fagan and Rupert Hughes and others of us who were warning about the communist plot to use Hollywood money and movies were reactionaries and bigots, because communist propagandists, who later went to jail for contempt of Congress, told him so. Larry Parks was a fool because he thought Marxism was a good thing. He confesses it. But he was not as big a fool as the policymakers of his government, who thought, or said they did, that Joe Stalin was a good fellow. And the pro-Russian and pro-Marxist officials of our government were not as big fools as the voters who put them there and kept them there term after term and still keep them there. Larry Parks was a fool because he thought to be liberal meant to be socialist, to favor a big papa government. Larry Parks and his Hollywood goodfellows had not paid enough attention to the basic principles of government to know that big papa government is the exact opposite of liberalism. Liberalism is the system which gives the opportunity for people to earn their own way and make their own successes or failures. To earn what they get and get what they earn and keep what they get, so long as it is not taking from others their opportunity to get and keep. Liberalism is the system whereby people have as little government, as few laws and officials over them as possible, taking as little of their savings and earnings as possible in taxes. That's the system Larry Parks, earning big money there in Hollywood, liked for himself.
But Larry Parks did not stop to think that out, so he contributed money to a political gang out to run the lives of everyone and take the earnings of everyone in taxes and the savings of everyone through changing the value of gold and our dollar to suit themselves. Larry Parks joined that group. Last week he came to Washington to tell the Un-American Activities Committee, which his group so long denounced and reviled, that he'd been a fool. After all, Larry Parks was not so much of a fool as our president, who sent Harry Hopkins to Moscow to give dictator Stalin twice as much American stuff as he needed to whip Hitler, and built Soviet Russia up into the second largest power in the world, ready to challenge us who saved her. Larry Parks was not so much a fool as two presidents who let Alger Hiss and Lattimore and their pals plan the future for this nation and the world, throwing all of Asia and Eastern Europe into a socialist dictator's hands. Larry Parks was not so much of a fool as a State Department, which gave everything to imperialist Stalin and then sent a diplomat to try to collect $11 billion owing for Lend-Lease when the Russians would not even agree to a settlement of $250,000. To tell you the truth, friends, Larry Parks was not so much a fool as the many, many well-meaning fools in government and big business and little business and churches and schools and women's clubs today, who think, now that Russian-style socialism called communism is very, very bad, British-style socialism called the welfare state is still the fashionable wave of the future they should be riding in this country. Larry Parks was not so much of a fool as the American liberals who now condemn the ravenous bear of Marxism called Russia, but suffer and coddle the cute little bear cat called socialism or social welfarism, which has already grown big enough to eat everything in Britain and is fattening itself through emergency controls here. Well, one more thought about Larry Parks and April Fool. Larry Parks expressed fear that public would repudiate him for having been a communist. The commander of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, Charles Rawls, at first said he hoped not. On second thought, he lost his temper and exploded. Parks was carrying a red card, he said, while we were overseas, and he made $1 million doing it. The VFW is certainly going to hold it against him. I know how Commander Rawls feels. At the same time, he should remember that his commander-in-chief and the command's policymakers, Harry Hopkins, Alger Hiss, Joseph P. Davies, and Averell Harriman, were doing far more for Joe Stalin than communist clubs in Hollywood could do at that time. And they were using American GIs and American production to do it. Don't think I'm excusing Hollywood Reds. It's from Hollywood Reds that all my trouble started, when Rupert Hughes and Cecil DeMille and producer Victor Fleming and writer Myron Fagan and Upton Close on the networks and others based in Hollywood started to expose the Reds. We paid for it with our contracts. We were smeared by an organized racial pressure group. Writer Myron Fagan tells all about it in a booklet you can get from him in Hollywood. No, I'm not excusing Larry Parks and his pals, but after all, they were little propagandists for a cause that worked from the top down. Let's hope that patriotic groups like the Veterans of Foreign Wars understand the reach of treachery in America and condemn it in high places as well as low. FBI Chief Edgar J. Hoover has issued warning of the danger of communist sabotage in this country, while Communist Party members are still having a field day, ignoring the McCarran Act, which requires them and their fellow traveling organizations to register. Communists are doing as they please, while Truman's Subversive Activities Control Board chief, Seth Richardson, and the Supreme Court battle out legalities. Another communist attempt to frustrate the Ober Act in Maryland, which prevents persons who will not take the oath of loyalty from running for office, is not doing so well. The Maryland court will not act in time to enable the contesting lady to run for office. And Michael Obermeyer, head of the New York Hotel Employees Union, convicted of perjury for saying he was not a communist, who thought he could get off through the higher courts, has to go to jail. That's some encouragement to patriots. You who have been watching television lately know how scared the crime investigation witnesses are of getting caught on a perjury charge. They look and act like scared mice instead of big, tough ex-bootlegger gangsters. They try to be awfully polite, as their lawyers instruct them. But patriots want laws which catch traitors for treachery, not just for lying about it. More states should pass laws like that Texas law the Texas legislator Marshall Bell told us about a few weeks ago on this program. I'm sure that common people who are not diplomats got a lot of joy out of the upset of the World State Department when General MacArthur took the bull by the horns and told the Chinese command just what they could do to put an end to fighting and what they'd get if they did not do it. I'm sure that fighting and paying American citizens generally wears greatly out of patience as MacArthur at his inability to get any instructions at all from the double-dealing British socialist government and the toadying Atchison State Department and the vacationing Truman. Dean Atchison bit out half his mustache, but his boys now report that, quote, friction between Washington and General MacArthur is being cleared up by important behind-the-scenes negotiations. Ha, ha, ha. In Congress, investigations are likely to continue. The public has got an appetite for them, even if Democratic chairmen would like a release. Above all, the investigation of RFC should continue and spread into Army procurement expenditures and the other government corporations. Why not ask Senator Williams of Delaware to get into the Commodity Credit Corporation records again? Remember, a year ago, Senator Williams' subcommittee found that the Commodity Credit Corporation did not even have vouchers for millions of dollars it had spent. As a matter of fact, it apparently did not even have a bookkeeping system. This is the branch that buys potatoes, eggs, and all that sort of thing and destroys them. The comment of old Jesse Jones, who administered the RFC during war years, is the quote of the week. Quote, "If we cannot have integrity in our government," said Jones, "why sacrifice our boys in Korea and our billions in defense of our country?" The RFC now stands accused not only of lending money to gambling houses and swank hotels, but of starving essential war processes. William O'Neill of General Rubber and Tire Company says it got turned down on a process that would hike our synthetic rubber immediately. Maybe the socialist British influence that sells rubber to Red China reaches into RFC policy. Could that be? Has Perón got atomic energy or hasn't he? That's the quiz question of the week. I've talked to top atomic scientists. They doubt everything until proved, of course, but they won't say no because everything is possible in science. A number of fine German and Austrian nuclear sciences are known to have settled in Argentine. If they've discovered a simpler system, not requiring the immense plant we have at Oak Ridge and Hanford, which, of course, Perón does not have, it would be, say my scientist advisors, doubtless through the junction of elements instead of fission of elements. And without the unearthly heat of sun or stars, only one way of joining elements into heavier ones is known. Scientists call it resonance. I wouldn't say it's known, it's a theory. The theory is that if by accident certain atoms are subjected to frequency of a vibration which would speed itself up, sort of like a bridge beginning to rock from a dog trotting over it, the atoms might shake till they break down. Well, we'll know in time if Perón is bluffing, but surely he does have this conference of diplomats from American countries meeting here now, guessing and gossiping like a ladies' aid society. The worst news of the week is that the dollar keeps dropping. Now it's going to take more dollars than ever to ship everything on the railroads, which will make everything we use go up because everything gets shipped. And unions want another raise. Everybody can strike, it seems, but the taxpayer. The best news of the week is that the great Cadillac tank plant at Cleveland has begun production several months before anyone dreamed it could. That and General Marshall's report on the increase of armed forces inspired defense mobilizer Charles Wilson to say that enough might to deter Russia from attack upon us is now in sight. So, in spite of increasing disorder in the Middle East and the prospect of having to share oil with Russia there, Americans are now in prospect of a peace scare, I dare say. That brings me to the question to be settled in Congress this coming week. Our guest, one of the youngest men in the House, Representative Harold H. Belday of Mid-State, Illinois, a war veteran and an old FBI man, on the subject of sending troops to Europe. Mr. Belday, please.
First of all, Mr. Close, I would like to state that my mail has been filled with objections to sending troops to Europe under present conditions, especially without the consent of Congress. I believe it is plain to everyone who wants to see the situation as it is that the American public has no confidence or trust in the President. This is regrettable, but still a fact. They do have confidence in their elected representatives and senators, however, and for that I am thankful. I believe if the American people can depend upon the fact that their elected Congress has the privilege of looking into such matters, that they will go along with our decisions. I do not believe it necessary to give carte blanche to the President to send troops wherever he feels. I also believe that if it becomes necessary to establish a standing army in Europe, it should be done only if the European countries who will derive the benefit of our backing also join us wholeheartedly in protecting their own countries. Why should it be necessary for America to forever be a wet nurse to Europe? Europe surely can understand that. While we want peace and are willing to fight for it, we expect them to share their part of the burden and be fair enough to furnish manpower. If a man cannot or is not willing to defend his own castle, why then should another man take up the burden? I also believe that we should come to a successful conclusion in Korea before we burden ourselves with the furnishing of troops to Europe. Until the North Atlantic community is unified, I deny that there is anything America can do to help in creating an effective defense establishment for Western Europe. Everyone's guess is as good as another's when it comes to the guess about the potential communist aggressor. The communist aggressor knows that the free nations of the world are not unified today. There is probably a greater will to resist outside the Atlantic Pact than there is within it. If the aggressor knew without question that the resources of all other nations, not merely some nations, were joined in a common concert of determination to fight to the finish, then unless the aggressor wishes to commit suicide and destroy civilization, he would say to himself, "There is no point in fighting against so large a group of nations who are determined to resist me to their utmost." Therefore, I again state that until the European nations show a desire to join with us for their and our own protection, we are whistling in the dark by sending troops and materials overseas.
Thank you, Congressman Velde of Illinois. And be with me again next week, same station, same time. If you want a copy of this script in printed form, write to Washington 4, D.C., to Upton Close.
At this time, Upton Close was a weekly broadcaster. He was not a daily broadcaster as he had been on NBC and Mutual. As you can tell from his style, he was very much American first, very much an isolationist, and strongly anti-communist. And part of the reason why he was no longer on a number of these stations and on these networks was left-wing groups went after him. They did not like his opinions. A number of commentators like Alex Dreier and Walter Winchell, they continued for years, even though they were strongly opinionated, and, they went after their own items to joust. Anyway, there you've heard it. 3 commentators and an early newsreel here on Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox, so you hear a number of what's going on. And, of course, commentators continue up until the 60s. In fact, the last real news commentator was Paul Harvey. And, of course, you still have, through talk radio, a large amount of opinionated talk hosts. So there you go. Thank you for tuning in. We'll get to, hopefully, some more shows next week. We'll move off the news vein, but I felt it was appropriate considering that we had just gone through the end of World War II. And thought we'd spend some time looking at newscasters and commentators, which is how most people got their news of the day. Thanks for tuning in to Classic Radio Theater, our webpage, classicradio.stream. If you'd like to drop us a little support there, we'd be more than happy to have it. And, of course, tell all your friends. You can hear all of the great radio shows right here, Classic Radio Theater with Wyatt Cox. Thanks for tuning in.